She stood at the foot of the grand staircase, her hand resting on the polished banister, and felt the last ember of hope inside her chest finally turn cold. The ballroom beyond the double doors glittered with candlelight and music. She could hear the murmur of 100 voices, the low ripple of laughter, the delicate chime of crystal glasses. And somewhere in that golden room, her husband was dancing with another woman. Charlotte, Duchess of Thornwood, had dressed with care that evening. Her gown was pale blue silk, the exact shade of a winter sky. Her maid had woven seed pearls through her dark hair. She had stood before the mirror for a long time, trying to recognize the woman looking back. She had told herself that tonight might be different. Tonight he might see her. But Alexander had not seen her. He had walked straight past her in the entrance hall, his cool gray eyes brushing over her face as if she were a piece of furniture. He had offered his arm not to his wife, but to Lady Emmeline Vance, a golden-haired widow who had arrived from London only a fortnight ago. Charlotte had watched her husband lead another woman into the ballroom, his head bent slightly to catch her words, the corner of his mouth lifting in that rare, subtle smile he never gave to his own Duchess. No one had looked at Charlotte. No one ever did. She was the invisible Duchess, the silent ornament at the edge of every room. After 2 years of marriage, society had learned what Alexander clearly wished them to know: she did not matter. She drew a slow breath, her fingers tightening on the banister. The pain was so familiar now it felt like a second heartbeat, but something was different tonight. The hope that had flickered stubbornly for 2 long years had finally guttered out. She did not feel angry. She did not feel desperate. She simply felt empty, and that emptiness, she realized, was a strange kind of freedom. She did not go into the ballroom. Instead, she turned and walked quietly up the stairs, her silk slippers making no sound on the marble. No one noticed her leave. No one ever did. That was the night Charlotte stopped loving her husband. Or rather, the night she stopped letting that love destroy her. The first year of their marriage had been a slow, bewildering ache. She had come to Thornwood Hall as a bride of 19, the daughter of a minor baron whose lands bordered the Duke's vast estate. The alliance had been arranged swiftly, almost coldly, after her father's health began to fail. Alexander needed the connection to secure a contested boundary. Her family needed the protection of his name. Charlotte had understood the transaction. But she had also been young enough, foolish enough, to believe that affection might grow from duty. At first she had tried so hard. She had learned his preferences, how he took his tea, which newspapers he read first, the quiet hour he spent in the library before supper. She had worn the colors he once mentioned suited her. She had filled the great stone house with fresh flowers, hopping to soften its shadows. She had waited up for him on the nights he returned late from Parliament, a lamp burning in the window like a small, stubborn signal that someone cared. Alexander had received it all with impeccable, devastating politeness. He thanked her for the flowers. He remarked that her gown was very fine. He never raised his voice, never spoke a cruel word. But he never stayed. He never lingered at the threshold of her sitting room. He never sought her out. He never in 2 years called her by her given name. She was always Your Grace, or, on the most formal occasions, my wife. The distance between them was as wide and silent as the moorlands that stretched beyond the estate. For a long time, Charlotte had believed she was simply not enough. Not beautiful enough, not witty enough, not worldly enough to capture the attention of a man like Alexander Thornwood. He was everything the ton admired: tall, dark-haired, with a face carved from restraint and secrets. He spoke rarely but commanded every room. He was brilliant, respected, and impossibly remote. She had spent countless nights lying awake in her vast, cold bedchamber, dissecting every small failure. Perhaps if she had laughed more brightly at his rare jests. Perhaps if she had been bolder, sharper, more intriguing. Perhaps then he would have looked at her the way he now looked at Lady Emmeline Vance. But after the night of the ball, a quiet clarity settled over Charlotte. She saw with painful precision that she had been trying to fill a cup with a hole in the bottom. No amount of effort, no endless churning of self-blame, could change the fact that Alexander did not want her. and she was too tired to keep pouring herself out for a man who would never drink. The morning after the ball, she woke early and made a decision. She would stop chasing him. She would not be bitter and she would not be cold. She would simply be elsewhere. Her life would no longer orbit around the hope of his glance. If she must live in this grand, lonely house, she would find something to fill its silence that had nothing to do with her husband. She began with the Glasshouse. The Thornwood Glasshouse stood at the far end of the south garden, half hidden by overgrown hedges. It had been built 40 years earlier by Alexander's mother, the previous Duchess, who had been a passionate botanist. After her death, the glasshouse had been locked and forgotten. Charlotte had discovered it by accident one afternoon, wandering the neglected paths, and something about the tarnished brass key still hanging beside the door had called to her. Inside, it was a ghost of beauty. Rusted iron frames held shattered panes. Dead vines curled like brittle lace around rotted trellises. Seed trays lay under layers of dust and dried leaves. But Charlotte could see what it had once been. She could almost feel the lingering warmth of a woman who had loved this place, who had poured her soul into rare orchids and fragrant night-blooming jasmine. She started clearing the debris herself, her hands growing rough and her nails permanently lined with soil. The head gardener was scandalized. A duchess did not dig in dirt. Charlotte smiled, thanked him for his concern, and continued. There was something deeply healing in the physical labor, in the simple purpose of pulling weeds and scrubbing glass. Every pane she cleaned let in more light. Weeks passed. Spring softened into summer. Charlotte's days filled with seeds and cuttings, with ledgers of plant species and letters to botanical societies. She hired a young village boy to help her carry water and repair the broken frames. She stopped attending the formal dinners Alexander hosted for his political allies, sending polite regrets and eating alone in her sitting room with a book propped against the teapot. At first, she had expected him to notice, to perhaps ask why she was absent. He did not, and strangely that no longer cut like a blade. The wound had calloused over. She began visiting the village more often. The people of Thornwood had always been polite to their duchess, but now they grew genuinely warm. Charlotte started a small fund to repair the leaking roof of the schoolhouse. She sat with elderly widows, listening to their stories. She helped the apothecary organize his dried herbs, drawing on the botanical knowledge she was rapidly accumulating. She was not just the silent duchess anymore. She was becoming someone quietly, firmly her own. It was on an unseasonably warm afternoon in late August that Charlotte first met Dr. Alastair Rowe. She had been kneeling in the village garden behind the apothecary's shop, her skirts dusty and a smudge of earth on her cheek, trying to identify a peculiar flowering plant that had volunteered near the rosemary. A shadow fell over her, and a voice said, "That's wild clary. The leaves can ease inflammation, but the seeds are mildly toxic if brewed too strong." Charlotte looked up. The man standing there was perhaps 30, with kind hazel eyes and unruly brown hair that curled at his collar. He wore the simple, well-brushed coat of a country physician and carried a worn leather satchel. There was no fawning deference in his posture, only easy, intelligent curiosity. "You know your botany," Charlotte said, surprised. He grinned, a flash of warmth that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It's difficult to practice medicine in the countryside without learning a little herb lore. I'm Alastair Rowe. I've just taken over old Dr. Pembroke's practice." He inclined his head respectfully, but not stiffly. "You must be the Duchess. I've heard that you've been single-handedly reviving the Thornwood Glasshouse." Charlotte felt an unexpected flush of pleasure. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her as a person rather than a title. "I'm attempting to. It's slow work. All the best work is." He crouched down beside her, entirely unself-conscious, and pointed to the plant she was examining. "May I?" She nodded. For the next half-hour they talked about soil acidity, moon phases for planting, the medicinal properties of feverfew, the stubborn blight affecting the village apple trees. Alastair listened to her opinions with focused attention. He did not interrupt. He did not glance over her shoulder as if looking for someone more important. He simply stayed, present and engaged, treating her observations as worthy of real consideration. When Charlotte finally rose, dusting off her hands, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She had not realized how starved she had been for simple, human connection. "I come to the village every Tuesday to visit the apothecary," she found herself saying. "If you ever have any interesting specimens to share, I would welcome the conversation." Alistair's smile deepened. "I might just hold you to that, Your Grace." She walked back to Thornwood Hall that evening with a strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in her chest. It took her a while to recognize it. It was anticipation. Not the aching, desperate hope she had once carried for Alexander's attention, but a quiet, steady anticipation of something small and good. A conversation, a shared interest, the simple gift of being seen. She did not realize, as she entered the great hall and passed the library door, that a pair of cool gray eyes watched her through the crack. Alexander had been standing at the window, a neglected letter in his hand, and had observed his wife walking up the long drive with color in her cheeks and a dusty apron over her gown. He had not seen that expression on her face before. He did not know why it made something in his chest tighten uncomfortably. He turned away and told himself it was nothing. But it was not nothing. Over the following weeks, Alexander began, almost against his will, to notice. At first, the changes were merely absences. He had grown so accustomed to Charlotte's quiet, constant presence at the edges of his life, the fresh flowers she arranged each morning in the entrance hall, the cup of tea that appeared at his elbow during late work, the soft rustle of her gown as she passed his study door, that he did not register them as deliberate acts of care until they stopped. The flowers vanished. The tea did not come. The rustle of silk was replaced by silence. He found himself listening for her and hearing nothing. It unsettled him in a way he could not articulate. He began to observe her with a sharper, more covert attention. He noticed that she rose earlier now, leaving the house before breakfast with a basket and garden shears. He noticed the faint tan on her forearms, the tiny scratches on her hands from thorns and brambles. He noticed that she no longer looked toward the door when he entered a room. That last detail lodged itself under his skin like a splinter. For 2 years, without ever consciously acknowledging it, he had felt the weight of her gaze. At dinner, at church, on the rare evenings they sat in the same drawing room, her eyes had always followed him with a mix of hope and wounding that he had found both flattering and suffocating. He had not known how to respond to it, so he had ignored it, telling himself he was sparing her from his own cold, complicated nature. But now she did not look. Her attention was fixed elsewhere, on her plants, on her village projects, on letters from the Botanical Society which she read at breakfast with quiet absorption, and he soon discovered with a sharp jolt on the new physician. He first saw them together in the village. He had ridden out to inspect a tenant's fence dispute and decided to pass through the main street on his return. Near the apothecary's shop, he saw Charlotte standing beside a tall, brown-haired man, their heads bent together over a basket of herbs. She was laughing. The sound drifted across the lane, light and unguarded, and Alexander's hands tightened on the reins. He had never heard her laugh like that. He had never, he realized with a cold wash of shame, made her laugh like that. The physician said something, and Charlotte touched his sleeve briefly, a gesture of easy familiarity. Alexander felt a surge of something hot and possessive that he had no right to feel. He urged his horse forward before he could be seen, his jaw set, his mind churning with questions he did not want to answer. That evening, he found himself standing outside the Glasshouse. The door was ajar, spilling warm lamplight into the twilight. Through the panes, he could see her moving among rows of green seedlings, her hair loosely pinned, a smudge of soil on her cheek. She was humming under her breath. She looked content. She looked, he thought with sudden, painful clarity, as though she had built a world that did not include him at all. He did not knock. He did not speak. He simply stood in the growing dark, watching the light inside, and felt the first stirrings of an emotion he had spent his entire life avoiding: regret. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of turning leaves and wood smoke. Charlotte had spent the morning in the glasshouse, repotting a shipment of exotic orchid cuttings that had arrived from a botanical garden in Edinburgh. The work absorbed her so completely that she lost track of time. It was only when her stomach growled loudly that she realized the afternoon had slipped away. She washed her hands in the basin beside the potting bench, tidied her hair as best she could, and walked toward the house. She intended to take a simple tray in her sitting room, as had become her custom. But as she passed the library, a voice stopped her. "Charlotte." She froze. In 2 years of marriage, Alexander had never spoken her name, not once. It had always been a formal address, a title that kept her at arm's length. Hearing her own name in his low, measured voice felt almost like a physical touch. She turned slowly. He stood in the library doorway, one hand braced against the frame. He was in his shirt sleeves, his cravat loosened, and there was something different in his expression. A tension, an uncertainty she had never seen before. "You missed luncheon," he said. It was such a mundane observation, yet it felt loaded with unspoken meaning. "I was working in the glasshouse," she replied, keeping her voice even. "I lost track of the hour." He nodded, his gray eyes searching her face as if looking for something he had lost. "You spend a great deal of time there." "It brings me peace." She said it simply, without accusation, but she saw him flinch just slightly, as if the words had found a tender place. There was a long pause. The old Charlotte would have filled that silence with nervous chatter, with eager questions about his day, with desperate attempts to bridge the gap between them. This Charlotte simply waited, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Finally, Alexander spoke again. "I have been remiss." She tilted her head, genuinely puzzled. "In what regard?" He seemed to struggle, the words clearly foreign to him. "In my attentions. I realize I have not asked after your projects. I did not know the Glasshouse meant so much to you." Charlotte considered him for a moment. His discomfort was almost palpable, a man trying to navigate an emotional landscape he had never mapped. A part of her, the old, hopeful part, wanted to soften, to make it easy for him. But she had spent too many years doing that, and it had left her hollow. "You did not ask," she said gently, without malice. "There is no need to apologize now. I have managed quite well." His expression flickered. Something that might have been hurt quickly masked. He was not accustomed to being gently dismissed. "I see you often in the village," he pressed, his voice tightening. "With the physician." Charlotte blinked, surprised by the shift. "Dr. Rowe has been assisting me with some medicinal herbs for the apothecary. His knowledge is extensive." "I am sure it is." There was an edge to the words now, a subtle sharpness. "He seems very attentive." She understood then. The tightness around his mouth, the rigid set of his shoulders. It was jealousy. She almost laughed, though the sound would have been bitter. For 2 years she had been invisible, and now, because another man offered her simple friendship, her husband suddenly saw her silhouette. "He is a friend," Charlotte said, her voice cool and steady. "Friendship is something I have had to seek outside these walls since it was not available within them." The blow landed. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, in the brief closing of his eyes. She had not intended to wound him, but she would not lie, either. She had spent too long softening truths for his comfort. "I see," he said quietly. "Do you?" she asked, and the question hung between them, heavy and unresolved. She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked toward the staircase, leaving him standing alone in the library doorway, the silence of the great house pressing down on him like a judgment. The weeks that followed were strange and strained. Alexander did not retreat into his usual cold distance. Instead, he hovered at the edges of her world, a shadow she could not quite shake. He began appearing in the garden, claiming to inspect the grounds. He joined her for breakfast twice, sitting at the far end of the long dining table, attempting stilted conversation about the weather and estate matters. He asked with awkward formality if he might see the Glasshouse. Charlotte did not make it easy for him. She was not cruel, but she was no longer accommodating. She answered his questions politely and briefly. She did not expand. She did not invite. The part of her that had once craved his attention had gone silent, and she did not know if it could ever be woken again. One afternoon, while Charlotte was visiting the village school, Alastair Rowe found her in the small garden behind the schoolhouse. He was carrying a battered leather book, its spine cracked with age. "I thought you might like to see this," he said, handing it to her. It belonged to the previous Duchess. The Dowager left several boxes of books with old Dr. Pembroke years ago. I only just got around to sorting them. Charlotte opened the book carefully. It was a botanical journal, filled with delicate watercolor sketches of plants and handwritten notes in a graceful, slanting script. Her breath caught. This was Alexander's mother's work, the woman whose ghost she felt every time she stepped into the Glasshouse. "Are there more?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Alastair nodded, his gaze warm with understanding. "Several. I'll bring them to you next week. It seems right that you should have them." Charlotte pressed the journal to her chest, unexpectedly moved. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." Alastair hesitated, then said quietly, "The Dowager was a remarkable woman. It's a shame her son never speaks of her." Charlotte looked up sharply. "You knew her?" There was a pause, so brief she almost missed it. "I knew of her," Alastair said carefully. "My mother spoke of her often." Before Charlotte could question him further, a shadow fell across the garden path. She turned. Alexander stood at the gate, his riding boots dusty, his face set in an expression she could not read. His gaze moved from her face to Alastair, then to the journal clutched in her hands. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or alarm. "Your Grace," Alastair said, bowing with perfect composure. Alexander did not acknowledge him. His attention was fixed on the journal. "Where did you get that?" His voice was low, almost dangerous. "Dr. Rowe found it among some old books," Charlotte said, stepping forward. "It belonged to your mother. It's a botanical journal full of her sketches." Alexander's face went pale. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and strode away, his shoulders rigid, leaving Charlotte and Alastair staring after him in stunned silence. Charlotte did not see Alexander for the rest of that day. He locked himself in his study, and when she passed the door in the evening, she heard no sound within. The house felt heavy, suffused with some old grief she did not understand. The next morning she decided to confront him. She had spent too long tiptoeing around his silences. She found him in the library, standing before the cold fireplace, a glass of brandy untouched on the mantel. He looked as though he had not slept. "Alexander," she said, closing the door behind her. "What happened yesterday? Why did my holding your mother's journal disturb you so deeply?" He did not turn. "It is not your concern." "She is my concern now," Charlotte said quietly. "I have spent months restoring the Glasshouse she loved. I have read her notes, learned from her plants. I feel a connection to her I cannot explain. And I think you owe me the truth about why her memory is buried in this house like a shameful secret." He turned then, and the rawness in his face made her breath catch. His mask had cracked. Beneath the cold duke was a man in pain. "My mother died giving birth to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father never forgave me. He raised me to believe that my very existence was a curse, that love is a weakness that destroys those who offer it. He sealed the Glasshouse the day she died and forbade anyone to speak her name." He swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "I have spent my entire life believing that to love someone is to doom them, that I am not safe to love." Charlotte stared at him, her heart cracking open. The distance he had kept, the coldness, the relentless politeness, it had never been rejection. It had been fear. A terrified, lifelong terror that if he let himself care for her, She would be taken from him just as his mother had been. She took a step closer. "Alexander," she said gently, "you are not your father, and I am not your mother." "I know that," he said hoarsely, "but I could not take the risk. When we married, I swore I would give you everything except my heart because I believed my heart was poison. But watching you pull away, watching you smile at that physician," his voice broke, "I realized I had lost you anyway, and the loss was worse than any fear." Tears burned in Charlotte's eyes. She had ached for this man for so long, and now, seeing him stripped of his armor, she understood that he had been aching too. Differently, silently, but just as deeply. "I am not lost," she whispered, "but I am not the same woman who spent 2 years waiting by a window for a husband who could not look at her. If you want me, Alexander, you will have to learn to see me. Not the image of some tragedy that happened before you were born. Me." He looked at her for a long, trembling moment. Then, for the first time since their wedding day, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers were cold, but they held on as if she were the only solid thing in a shifting world. "Teach me," he said, his voice raw and unguarded. "Please." The days that followed were not a fairy tale transformation. Alexander did not become a different man overnight. But he began, with painful, visible effort, to try. He visited the Glasshouse and listened while she explained the delicate needs of orchids. He accompanied her to the village and stood quietly at her side while she spoke with tenants. He asked her questions, real questions, about her thoughts, her dreams, the books she read. And slowly, tentatively, Charlotte allowed herself to hope again. Not the desperate, clinging hope of a neglected bride, but a quiet, cautious hope built on the foundation of two people finally learning to speak the truth. The lingering shadow was Alastair Rowe. Alexander's jealousy had not vanished. Whenever the physician's name was mentioned, his expression tightened. Charlotte understood, but she also sensed that there was more to the story. Alastair's evasiveness about his connection to the Dowager Duchess gnawed at her. The truth came out on a gray November afternoon, during a confrontation she did not see coming. Charlotte was alone in the Glasshouse, labeling newly sprouted seedlings, when she heard raised voices outside. She opened the door and saw Alexander and Alastair standing on the gravel path, their stances combative, their words sharp with tension. "You have no right to be here," Alexander was saying, his voice icy. "I have tolerated your presence in the village, but I will not tolerate you circling my wife." Alastair's face was pale, but his voice was steady. "I am not your enemy, your grace, but I am tired of hiding. Charlotte deserves to know." "Know what?" Charlotte stepped forward, her heart pounding. Both men turned. Alastair drew a slow breath, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small oval locket. He opened it and held it out to her. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman with warm eyes and dark hair, the same woman whose sketches filled the botanical journal. "This was my mother, too," Alastair said quietly. "The Dowager Duchess gave birth to a son before she married your father, Alexander, a son she was forced to give away. That son was my father. I am your nephew." The world seemed to tilt. Charlotte grasped the doorframe. Alexander stood frozen, his face bloodless. The silence stretched, thick and disbelieving. "My mother had a child out of wedlock before her marriage, and she never told anyone," Alastair continued, his voice low and aching. "She kept it secret to protect her family's reputation, but she never forgot. She left provisions for my father in her will and a letter explaining everything. I only learned the truth a few years ago. I came to Thornwood to understand her world, to see the place she loved. I never meant to cause harm." Charlotte looked at Alexander. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were shaking. The mother he had mourned, the mother whose death he had carried as guilt his entire life, had a hidden story that made her more human, more flawed and more loving than he had ever known. She had loved a child she could not keep. She had loved another son. "All this time," Alexander murmured, his voice barely audible, "I thought I was the cause of her death. and now I find she lived with a grief I never knew." Alastair shook his head. "My father said she always spoke of you with joy. The letters she sent him were full of stories about her little boy, the heir who was so serious and so bright. She loved you, Alexander. She loved you more than her own life." Charlotte watched the last wall inside her husband crumble. His shoulders sagged. A sound escaped him, half sob, half breath. She went to him, her hand slipping into his, anchoring him. He gripped her fingers as if she were the only thing keeping him from drowning. "You are not a curse," she whispered. "You were never a curse. You were a child who was loved and who was taught a terrible lie by a grieving father, but that lie ends now. Do you hear me? It ends now." He turned to her, his gray eyes wet, and in that moment Charlotte saw not the cold Duke, but the lonely boy who had spent a lifetime believing himself unlovable. "I have wasted so much time," he said, his voice breaking. "I have wasted 2 years of you, 2 years I will never get back." Charlotte reached up and touched his cheek, a gesture of such simple tenderness that he flinched, as if kindness were a language he was still learning to speak. "Then do not waste another day," she said softly. Alastair stood quietly a few paces away, his own eyes bright. "I will leave Thornwood if my presence causes you pain," he said, "but I hoped we might know each other, as family." Alexander looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly he extended his hand. "You are my blood," he said, his voice rough but steady. "And blood, I am learning, is not something to run from." They shook hands as the November wind swirled around them, and Charlotte felt something settle inside her chest. A healing, a beginning. Christmas came to Thornwood Hall that year, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the great house was filled with warmth. Not the hollow warmth of forced festivities, but a genuine, quiet glow. Alexander had ordered the ballroom opened and decorated with holly and ivy. The village was invited. Alastair attended, no longer a stranger but seated at the family table. Charlotte wore a gown of deep green velvet, and Alexander, when he saw her descend the staircase, stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds. "You are beautiful," he said, and the words were simple, unpolished, and utterly sincere. She smiled, a smile that reached her eyes. "You are learning." He laughed, a real, startled laugh that made several guests turn in surprise. The Duke of Thornwood was laughing. The world had shifted on its axis. That evening, after the last guest had departed and the servants had banked the fires, Alexander and Charlotte stood together in the Glasshouse. He had hung small lanterns among the rafters, and their light danced across the leaves and petals like captured stars. It was the place where his mother's ghost had finally found peace, and where his wife had rebuilt herself from the ashes of neglect. "I have a gift for you," Alexander said, producing a small velvet box. Inside lay a brooch in the shape of a flowering vine, tiny emeralds sparkling along its stem. "It belonged to my mother. I found it among her things. I think she would have wanted you to have it." Charlotte's eyes blurred with tears. She pinned it to her bodice with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me at last." He took her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "I see you," he said. "I see the woman who refused to break, the woman who grew a garden in a wasteland, the woman who gave me a second chance I did not deserve." His voice thickened. "I love you, Charlotte. I have loved you from the first moment you walked into this cold house, and I was too afraid to say it. I loved you too late, but I will spend the rest of my life loving you in time." She kissed him then, soft and unhurried, in the glowing heart of the Glasshouse. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of homecoming, of two souls finally arriving in the same place after a long and winding road. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, silent and gentle, covering the scars of the old year. Inside, the Duchess and her Duke held each other, and the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of all the words they had finally learned to say, full of a future that stretched ahead, green and growing, like seeds planted at last in fertile ground. And in the village, in a small cottage with a fire crackling in the hearth, Alistair Rowe opened his grandmother's journal and read her words. "Love is not a weakness. It is the only thing that outlasts the frost." He smiled, closed the book, and looked out at the falling snow. Content.